This is Caffeinated Risk, the monthly podcast for security professionals by security professionals, focused on the principles of enterprise security risk management, exploring technology and business management issues and how they relate to information security risk. Once a month, two self-proclaimed grumpy security guys bring you analysis, insights, and interviews with leading security risk professionals to learn how they work through a project, a program, or their careers using a risk-based approach to security. Now here are your hosts, Tim McCreet and Doug Leese.
Welcome, folks, to the next podcast from Caffeinated Risk. In this session, we chat with Terry Ingoldsby, the president of Amenaza Technologies Limited, and it's about attack trees. So Terry was working as a threat risk assessment specialist back in the 1990s, and he was doing an engagement for a client. He was trying to find a more consistent approach to determining risk, but he couldn't find anything in the market. So in some of his time off, which wasn't a whole lot, Terry had a chance to attend a couple of conferences where Bruce Schneier was the keynote speaker, and Bruce was talking about attack trees. But he put a challenge out to the folks attending the conferences to come up with a way to turn this into an application or a piece of software that would look at security risks from the attack tree perspective. Terry took up that challenge, and then he started Amenaza. Such a cool approach and such a really cool way of looking at security risks from that perspective. So since then, Terry and his team have been perfecting this approach to assessing risks, and he's found some dedicated clients in government, aerospace, and a couple of other agencies he's really not able to talk about, but some pretty cool stories from him. So now let's check out our latest podcast from Terry Ingoldsby.
Well, welcome, Terry. This is excellent to have you on. Thank you for agreeing to do the podcast. Terry and I actually go way back to the origins of this software, believe it or not.
Holy, that's crazy.
And I think it's one of those historical things. It's maybe not quite as impressive as some of Wynn's stories, because nothing can top that.
We were young then, and our hair was a different color.
There, I was going to say, yeah, there you go.
It was. But yeah, Terry, maybe you could start with sort of our origins of Amenaza and the whole attack tree thing. Maybe even start right back at those early days of the Calgary Unix users group.
I'll be delighted to tell you a little bit how, the question I think you're really asking is, how did I end up in this? How have I possibly stayed here for all these years? And it started way back in, I suppose the real origins are back in about 1995, when I started a consulting company here in Calgary called Distributed Computing Experts. And DC Experts was very much involved in system administration and network security. These were the early days of the internet. I was involved with, back in those days, actually building firewalls, and then later on, managing the commercial ones that started to come afterwards, all this kind of technology.
Right.
And one of the things that I got kind of drug into was that people wanted me to come in and do some type of a security assessment. I think we kind of called it back those days. And I would go in and I would, poke around and prod around at the stuff they had. And, I kiddingly say I used to walk around the server room with a willow divining rod, and I'd walk around until the rod twitched in front of a particular server. And then I'd write up a report about how the demons had infested that server and why something needed to be done about it.
I think we still do that today, for God's sake, really. So, yeah, that sounds familiar, right? So, yeah.
Sadly, there's a lot of truth in that, and that's actually why I'm in this business. And, I realized at one point I delivered a report and I thought, this is a good report. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But if I ever get called to court or to something like that to try and defend why I've said your problem is here and it's not there and this, I don't know how I'm ever going to have any way of explaining to a judge why I made those particular recommendations. So immediately I thought, the problem here is I lack training. This is what I need is more training. So I thought I'll go to the conferences and I'll take these expensive courses on risk assessment. Well, after the first 2 or 3 courses, I concluded that the instructors knew no more about the subject than I did, and that somehow something had to improve here. Well, as it happened, since I seem to be going to a lot of conferences, I attended a session given by the noted cryptographer and security expert, Bruce Schneier. And Mr. Schneier, he did a great job. He put up this presentation, and all of a sudden, the lights started to go on. Now, my background, I am in computer science, and I do have a master's degree in computer science, but my first degree was in physics. And I've been looking for kind of a scientific, mathematical basis to make decisions, a rigor behind things, an engineering approach, I'm going to call it. Schneier put these slides up and started talking about these trees, excuse me, these trees, and showing how you could diagram out how attackers would approach a target and how you could start to select or understand which paths through this graphical construction they would be most likely to follow. Mm-hmm. I thought, this is it. This, where have you been all my life?
I'm pretty sure Bruce Schneier never, ever gets people saying that.
No, I'm going to bet that's a no, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. So I went up to Mr. Schneier afterwards and I said, I'm just amazed. And I don't think anybody else in the room was. I was the only guy talking to him. And in fact, I think he was kind of disappointed by that because most people kind of yawned and walked out. And me, I'm on the edge of my seat. So I said to him, I said, this is great. Is there any software available to do this kind of work? And he says, no, not really. I said, oh, okay. And I kind of departed. About a year later, I'm at another conference. Schneier drags out, I think it was the same slide deck. It does the same presentation. Yep. And I'm still equally awed. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, Bruce, I'm really impressed by all this. Is there any software? He says, still no. I said, well, would you mind if I tried to produce some software? He says, no. He says, that's why I'm going around giving these talks, is in the hope that somebody will pick this up and run with it. I said, well, let me give it a try. So, it was one of these things I thought, how hard can this be, right? Yeah, that was 21 years ago.
Yeah.
And after I worked on it for a while, it became obvious that this was a far more major endeavor than what I had anticipated, and that beyond that, it had far more potential for changing the world than did my little Calgary consulting company. So at that point, we kind of sat down and reorganized and said, we better form another company to do this. And the company we formed is Amenaza Technologies. Amenaza actually is Spanish for threat or menace. But, over the years, we've really persisted and developed a very sophisticated tool. What really surprised me in the beginning is I had imagined in my sort of delusions that since I had a lot of contacts and a lot of experience in Calgary and the oil and gas community, that is where our customer base would come from. To my surprise, we started getting calls from faraway places in the Washington-Baltimore corridor, primarily from people involved in defense things. I had one guy who phoned up and he says, are you the guys that do attack tree analysis? Yeah, we're the guys. He says, really? You do attack trees? Yes, we do attack trees. Oh, he says, we got to talk to you. I said, well, how did you hear about us? He says, and this is the early days of search engines things, and he says, I was doing some searching on the internet, and I found this organization called CUG. Oh, you mean CUG, the Calgary Unix Users Group.
Yes.
Oh, my.
In a previous life, I had been president of the Calgary Unix Users Group, and I actually came back when we were first starting this. In fact, I think before Amenaza was even created, and I did a presentation on attack tree analysis, and somebody in the CUG organization wrote it up and posted it on the CUG website. And this guy had stumbled into it, and that's where we got our first contact. It really came from CUG. Wow. From that, it progressed, and we found ourselves involved in projects that I would never have imagined us getting involved in. Many of them, first of all, they don't tell me about. Some I couldn't tell you if I did know. But the one that I will tell you about, because we're allowed to speak about it a little bit, is that our software began to be used to help do the information assurance on the avionics for the F-35 fighter plane.
Wow.
And we're actually considered an F-35 subcontractor under Lockheed Martin. And, those are the kind of people who initially gravitated to our product. And the reason why it appealed to these people is because these are truly engineers. I mean, we're talking engineering companies. And that's one of the strong points that I'd like to make is IT security is kind of a rogue. We're about the only practice, only field that people go and design and build things and have no idea what they're going to get when they're done. You know, the basic formula most people use in the security field, in my opinion, is every year they get a budget. They take and spend that budget based largely on vendor hype, personal opinions, and sometimes just random factors. Then they sit back and watch to see if all this stuff they bought and bolted on will actually have the effect that they want. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't, they wait for next year's budget, and then they go ahead and buy more stuff, bolt it on, and again they pray. Any engineer worth their salt, when they build something, I don't care if it's a plane or a bridge or a building or whatever it is, they know what they're going to get before they ever start constructing things.
I do agree that we don't have a general, you got to be this high to ride, you got to be this high to get on the roller coaster, this high to get in the ball tank, but nobody really tells you how good your firewall rule set has to be before you're considered safe against a nation-state adversary.
Doug, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's the SL levels out there, 1 through 4. But my complaint is not that the levels aren't out there, but nobody has ever told organizations what level they're expected to withstand. And the consequence of that is, understand it from a business's point of view. Every time you raise that bar, that costs them money, which makes them less competitive.
Right.
The crux of your question is, how do we get people to do this? There's several things that have to happen. First of all, you have to tell organizations what they're expected to do. One thing that I can tell you doesn't work, because I've been observing it, is the best practices lists. I tell people, you can be secure without being compliant. You can be compliant without being secure. You really need to be both compliant and secure. These lists are a good starting point for people who are just kind of getting their feet wet and saying, what kind of stuff are we supposed to have? But the fact that you do everything on the best practices list doesn't necessarily mean that you are secure and can withstand these adversaries. What we need to do is stop saying, we're going to specify in this bridge that you're building the exact detail of how you're going to connect the beams together, the type of rivet and so forth. What we're going to tell you is we expect that this bridge is going to handle this particular load, and if it falls down after we told you it had to handle that load, you are liable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
That way, management then gets to make realistic decisions, not as to have we done the 20 things on the list, but are we secure enough that we feel that we can, either withstand the attack or show why we weren't expected to do so? And management has to take the lead on this. I noted that, in the case of aerospace, none of this was being driven by the techies at the low level who were building some sort of board that had some weird sensor in it to detect tampering. This was being determined from very high up, that they basically said, whether you like it or not, whether you think it's worthwhile, whether you think anything about it, before you go any further, you are going to give us threat models that show how and if this technology can be compromised. And it's that whole change of mindset that I think has to occur. Mm-hmm. The real problem comes, in my mind, that they haven't set out very hard requirements for what their technical people have been asked to do and give them the resources. No technical person faced with the fact that the firewall has caught fire is going to go work on a threat model.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
You have to say to people, I'm giving you enough resources, or have people dedicated to it, or we're going to rotate them through, or whatever it is, but we're going to give you enough resources to build these models. And the other thing I've noticed for organizations that are successful is don't get one guy to do this.
Right.
You need a core of, 3 or 4 or 5 people who are involved in threat modeling, who also have responsibilities in the real world, so that, these are practical models, not just hypothetical things.
And I think that's the key, right? Because it's to go in front of a group of executives, not that I've done that a couple of times in my career, but to go in front of a group of executives or elected officials or cabinet members and talk about something that is theoretical, hypothetical, and short of the Martians landing on the front of the Legislative Assembly, it's never going to happen. So I like the idea of coming with something practical. But the challenge I have, and this is where we've been really focused for the last few years on this whole ESRM methodology and practice, is that we can't go in front of executives and talk about technical stuff. We got to talk business. And the business understands and appreciates a few things. One, if this risk is realized, if this does occur, the likelihood and impact will actually cripple your business and you can't serve your clients. Well, that's a good opener for a conversation. Businesses understand that. Or your rate of return for your shareholders will be cut in half because the amount of dump from the stock that's going to occur if this thing happens, you haven't seen this yet. This is the impact.
Your next job, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the company killers, right? You can demonstrate and provide the data on it. So that's, I think, on us as a profession now is, you talked about the profession of engineering. Well, the whole goal that, between now and when I get out of this game is how do you raise security to be a profession and it's viewed the same? But it also means now I got to look back in on the profession and provide the consequence. Did you do your due diligence when you were assessing risks against your infrastructure? And would you put your designations up against it if something goes sideways?
Absolutely. We're trying to make this a profession, but you're absolutely right. We haven't done especially well in that. And I could probably talk for an hour at the historic reasons of why that's happened. But one thing I will point out is here's how I approach talking to management when we create one of these models. First of all, I never show them an attack tree in all its glory with all its branches, going down. They would their eyes would glaze over and they would start checking their phones, and their text messages or whatever.
Yeah.
Instead, what I do is I go in and, I like to set the stage. And first of all, impress them that, we've done a lot here. So I start off by saying, we sat down and did a review of this system, and we considered 127,000 different ways in which the system could be attacked. Now, I've got good news and I got bad news. Of the 127,000 ways it can be attacked, it turns out 110,000 of those, they're just never going to happen. Don't even let them cross your mind. They are just plain out and out impossible, impractical. They're not happening. So of the remainder, it turns out that there are 26 that are extremely high risk. And if those take place, the following bad things are going to happen to you. I really think you need to do something about those 27 things, if possible, before you leave work today. And in our models, we've tested them out. And yes, if you spend this amount of money and do these following things, we can pretty much nail maybe 25 of the 27 or something like that. Then I'll say, the remainder, they're in kind of that gray zone. They're not the stuff that, you should probably stay awake all night tonight worrying about, but you should be concerned about them enough to start considering what to do. Now, we've come up with 3 options here. Door number 1 is going to take care of pretty much all of those. And it's going to cost you this much. Door number 2 takes care of 3/4 of them. And, I might try and show a little bit about, where they're coming in is here. It's a physical security problem, or it's this, or it's that. And door number 3 takes care of, 50% of them, but it's really cheap. Now, management, I'm just here to tell you the news. I am in no way here to tell you what to do. But I have told you what you get for each amounts and how much residual risk you will have after spending those amounts.
Yeah.
So you basically, I walk out of this room today, you tell me how much risk you want to accept and tell me how much you want me to fix based on the amount of resources you're going to give me to fix it.
Very similar to how Scott was describing the thermometer conversation in our last episode.
Mm-hmm. And it's same as what Rochelle talked about from an ESRM perspective, and what Wynn was talking about was reducing time, right? I'm
sensing a theme here.
Holy swirl! Yeah. Imagine, right?
And the buzzword we came up with, which we stole, is informed consent, right?
Yes.
The board of directors is now adequately informed.
Yep. awesome. Terry, with all of the new technology that we're seeing and all the advances in technology, when you look at machine language as an example, do you see ML or AI becoming part of or working into this whole concept of attack trees?
Well, that's an excellent question, and one that's certainly pertinent because, of course, machine learning, artificial intelligence, they're all the rage right now, and you see a lot of products coming on the market that at least purport to use these techniques. A couple of comments about it is that, first of all, if you remember back when we talked about the different quadrants of risk,
right,
and we talked about quadrant 4, which was the quadrant where things happened all the time. But in the great scheme of things, they didn't matter all that much. They didn't tend to be the events that would end the life of an organization. My understanding is that in order for machines to learn, you have to give them lots of examples. So the quadrant 4 situation is exactly where they can get those examples. So I can see in general, just not talking specifically about attack trees, but I can see that quadrant 4 is where tools and technologies out there can learn from all the stuff that's going on. They can watch the chatter on the network and they can pick all this up and they can make some inferences and decide that, yes, this is good and that is bad. The problem comes when we talk about the quadrant 2 situations, which again, if you recall, are the things that don't happen very often and in fact may never have happened before, at least to a given organization. But if and when they do, they can be devastating. The problem I see is how does a system that uses machine learning manage to look at no data and learn? If not exactly the same thing, it follows the spirit of it. In an attack tree, we'll generally create a model and explore hundreds of thousands of different ways in which that asset can be attacked. The software will basically take and explore all the combinatoric possibilities, the combinations of exploits, and how they could be used for the adversary to reach a certain goal. And then what it does is it takes the information about those attacks and compares them to the characteristics of the attacker and effectively throws out the attacks that wouldn't matter and allows you to focus on the ones that do. Now, in a sense, what we're doing is we're simulating the data that a machine learning system should have. And some of those things it sees as critical and other things unimportant. So in a sense, we follow the philosophy, if not the actual practice.
So one more question, unless Tim, you got something?
No, I'm hoping you have one more because then I got one more after that. So you go ahead, man.
Okay, so when you're working with a customer, how would you help them identify when they've reached their point of diminishing returns? Fancy way of saying, please define your risk tolerance.
You know, that is probably one of the best questions anyone could ask. Because many organizations feel that they know what they don't, what they want to stop happening. But in their heart of hearts, sometimes their mission statements don't reflect what they really believe. Oftentimes you get disconnects between senior management and lower levels in the organization as well.
I live that every day.
Absolutely. And it's unfortunate that the people at the lower levels, they're not trying to subvert corporate policy. They're doing what they think is their best and what management wants. They just don't always appreciate what it really is. And let me talk about the difference between which most people or many people often go down this rabbit hole. They start worrying about the worst possible case versus the worst case that they are willing to accept and tolerate, which is often quite a different thing. A number of years ago, this organization decided that I should come in and assist with a threat risk assessment that they were doing. Now, the organization was a polytechnic college, one of these colleges that teaches all sorts of things, everything from hairdressing to auto mechanics to welding, as a matter of fact. Well, this particular college was in the process of building a new building. And this building, it was really nifty. I got to see the blueprints. It hadn't been built yet. And this building was a great big building. And it had this big open area that was going to be filled with steel tables. And these tables were going to be used by the student welders. And just like you may be familiar that in IT settings, we often have in cubicles drops that come down from the ceiling with Ethernet cables in them.
Oh, yeah.
These guys had drops that came down from the ceiling with oxyacetylene piping or tubing.
So we got students with gas on demand.
This is going
to be good. I can just tell.
And they could weld to their heart's content. They could cut holes in things. They could whatever it was they wanted to do. They were going to be able to just go gangbusters here. Well, how did this whole thing work? Well, looking at the blueprints, I saw that on the side of the building, right attached to it, but sort of as a separate room on the side, there was this area. I don't know what it would have been, maybe 30 or 40 feet long and 10, 15 feet wide. And the idea, the theory, is it was going to be filled with oxyacetylene gas cylinders, several hundred of them, as a matter of fact. We started looking at this and started thinking about it and what could possibly go wrong here?
Right.
Well, in theory, all of these cylinders are connected to a common manifold. So if somebody gets into this room, they can open all the valves and all the cylinders, use the fire axe, which I'm sure would be in the room, to cut the main manifold, sit back and wait for a minute or two, and then flick their bic.
Right.
Well, it turns out that according to our calculations, it would have leveled the new welding building. It would have severely damaged the building in front of it. It would have killed several hundred students and faculty. It would have rendered the campus unusable for possibly months while this all got sorted out. It would have stopped classes. It would have been a true disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So me, in my mind, as the risk analyst there, said, I got it. I got myself my worst case scenario. And without going into the details of how we calibrate models, basically I normally set the worst thing to be a 1. Impact equals 1. I said, if anything's an impact equals 1, this has got to be it. 1. Great.
Mm-hmm.
So then I went and talked to the directors of that institution, and these guys were smart. These guys were really quite clever. They understood what business they were in. And they said the number one priority for us is the safety of our students, our faculty, and any guests on campus. Following closely thereafter is our ability to continue teaching classes. We don't want anything to get in the way of us teaching our classes.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, and finally, the third thing that we really care about is our reputation, because believe it or not, these trade schools, it's really quite competitive, and anything that would besmirch their reputation would have a long-term effect on them. I said, well, what about, the buildings and stuff? They said, obviously we care. We don't want the buildings to burn down, but in the great scheme of things, we don't worry too much about the physical stuff. That can be replaced. It just takes money. It's not a big deal. Well, this was the first clue I got of a major disconnect, because I had gone and talked to the folks in the security department and discovered that their focus was on protecting stuff.
Yep.
They had slapped burglar alarm devices on each of these projectors that back in the day when the projectors were $20,000 each probably made sense, but now the burglar alarm gizmo costs more than the projector.
Yeah. Oh, man.
So they were focusing on that. But then in talking to security, I did learn a very interesting thing. They said that sadly, and I suspect quite typical for any college or university campus, a couple times each year, someone, usually a young woman, would be accosted and sexually assaulted, perhaps walking from a building late at night after studying to her car in the parking lot. And they said, yeah, we get a couple of these every year, and we're really upset about them. So got thinking about this, and I started to see how this was going to play out. Okay, now if I have calibrated the death of 200 students, the ruinage of, say, $200 million worth of buildings, total cessation of courses on the campus, and destroyed reputation of the institution as a 1, where on that scale would the sexual assault of a young lady come?
Yeah.
Well, would that be a 0.01? This was totally inconsistent with the values that had been put forth by the administration of the institution. So I went back and looked at it and said, know what? We're actually going to probably characterize impact of one being maybe one death or serious injury that happens on campus. That proportionately would bring up, a sexual assault to some meaningful fraction of one, arguably not as bad as being killed, but certainly very serious.
Yeah.
And that was in keeping with the values of the institution. Well, you say, but what about the acetylene gas thing? How could you be ignoring that? Well, we didn't ignore it, but we looked at it again and we realized that yes, if a certain type of adversary presented themselves, and there was no particular indication that the kind of adversary who would want to die for the cause and flick their bick would actually be looking at a polytechnic school to do this sort of thing. If they were to present themselves, they would be easily stopped. On the entrances to this storage facility, all we had to do was put 2 or 3 layers of doors with alarms and cameras on each one and make sure that, they could break through them, but it was going to take 15 or 20 minutes on each layer. And by that time, campus security and the police and who knows who else are all going to be there to grab them before they ever get close to the inner sanctum.
Right.
So in this particular case, it was very important to understand what the worst tolerable impact was for the organization as opposed to the worst conceivable impact.
And that's where I wanted to get, Terry, was how was that accepted by the senior management, by the board of directors, once you understood that tolerable risk?
Well, I almost want to turn it around. It's not they who had to accept it from me. They're the ones who gave it to me. So they almost couldn't reject it. It was me who had to accept that as their values.
Fair enough, yeah.
And let me say that you have brought up the greatest obstacle I have encountered in dealing with threat risk assessments, particularly in critical infrastructure. Generally speaking, just because of the nature of the problem, I usually end up talking to, at the highest, middle management. Basically, I talk to techies and I talk to middle management. They have their view of what the values are.
Sure. Yep.
They also drag out the corporate mission statement and they give that to me. And now I have, as the analyst, to decide, do I base my risk assessment based on what their directors, their CEOs, their high-level people have stated? And when I do that, then the middle-level people who don't understand their own mission statements are critical of it. On the other hand, if I were to do it the way the middle management people think is important, I've just lost the C-suite.
Yep.
So it's very, very important on these risk assessments that they be driven from senior management.
Thanks for that, because it does make it actually validates a lot of the work that we've been doing from the enterprise security risk management, that process or methodology, where it's the executives are the ones who create the goals and objectives for the organization. They're the ones who sign off on the statements that show up on your company website. And they're the ones that have to endorse or at least accept the remediation efforts that we recommend in all of our risk assessment.
No, this is great, Terry. Thanks a million. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yep.
Well, thanks so much, Doug and Tim. It's been great being with you and a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the latest podcast from Caffeinated Risk. Make sure you visit our website, caffeinatedrisk.com, to stay up to date on what we've been working on. Our website has bios of our podcast guests, posts about topics we're passionate about, and even a library of reference material we find valuable in the work we do every day. And don't forget to subscribe to Caffeinated Risk on your favorite podcast service. This way, you'll be notified when we release our next podcast, and you can listen to our previous guests just in case you missed them. Thanks so much for listening to Caffeinated Risk.